Some secrets are hidden because they are dangerous. Others are hidden because they are humiliating. But the most uncomfortable ones are the secrets that sit somewhere in between, where victory, intelligence, sacrifice, and silence all collide. This is top 5 British secrets kept hidden for decades because they were too embarrassing. 5 stories from Britain's wartime past that were buried, denied, classified, or quietly pushed aside because the truth was too awkward to face. And at number 5, we begin with one of the most haunting rumors of the Second World War, the Coventry Controversy. The year was 1940. Britain was standing almost alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. Hitler's armies controlled much of Europe, and every night the Luftwaffe crossed the Channel to bomb British cities into submission. But Britain had one weapon Germany did not know about. Not a battleship, not a bomber, not a secret army, a machine. Or more precisely, the secret work being done at Bletchley Park, where British codebreakers were trying to crack the German Enigma system. If Britain could read German messages, it could see into the enemy's mind, U-boat movements, air raids, military orders. In theory, Enigma could become one of the greatest intelligence victories in history. But there was one terrible rule. If Britain acted too clearly on decoded German messages, the Nazis might realize their code had been broken. And if that happened, the secret would vanish overnight. Then came 14th November 1940. That night, German bombers launched Operation Moonlight Sonata, a devastating raid against the industrial city of Coventry. Coventry was not just any city. It was a major manufacturing center, producing engines, aircraft parts, weapons, and equipment vital to Britain's war effort. To the Luftwaffe, it was a military target. To the people living there, it was home. Wave after wave of German bombers struck the city. Streets burned. Factories exploded. Homes collapsed. Coventry Cathedral was destroyed. By morning, the city had become a symbol of devastation. Hundreds were dead. Thousands were injured or homeless. The medieval heart of Coventry had been torn apart. And then, years later, came the question that would not die. Did Churchill know? The allegation was chilling. Some claimed British intelligence had intercepted German signals before the attack and discovered that Coventry was the target. According to the most dramatic version of the story, Churchill faced an impossible choice: evacuate the city and risk revealing that Britain had cracked Enigma, or stay silent and protect the secret that might help win the war. It was the kind of story people could not stop repeating because it felt almost believable. Cold, strategic, brutal, the sacrifice of one city to save a nation. But the truth is more complicated. Modern historians generally argue that Britain did receive warnings of a major German raid, but not clear, certain proof that Coventry was the target. Some intelligence pointed to possible targets using code names. Some analysts guessed wrong. Some messages were incomplete. And some were understood only after the bombs had already fallen. That is why the Coventry Controversy remains so powerful. Not because it proves Churchill sacrificed a city, but because it reveals the nightmare of wartime intelligence. What do you do when you know something terrible may happen, but not enough to stop it? What do you protect first? A city, a secret, or the future of the war? Coventry became more than a bombing raid. It became a moral wound, a story Britain never fully escaped. And even if the darkest version of the tale is not proven, the embarrassment remained. Britain's greatest intelligence secret was born in the same shadows where British civilians were dying. That is why the Coventry Controversy earns its place at number 5, not as the deadliest secret, but as one of the most haunting. Because sometimes the most dangerous question in history is not what leaders knew, it is what they could afford to admit. From Coventry, the story moves from silence in the face of uncertainty to silence in the face of evidence. At number 4 stands one of the most politically poisonous secrets of the Second World War, the Katyn Cover-Up. The massacre itself was created in 1940 in the dark machinery of Stalin's Soviet Union. After Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union carved up Poland in 1939, thousands of Polish officers, policemen, intellectuals, doctors, lawyers, professors, and officials fell into Soviet hands. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were the backbone of the Polish nation, the people who could rebuild Poland after the war, and that made them dangerous. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet NKVD carried out mass executions of Polish prisoners. Nearly 22,000 Polish officers and members of the elite were murdered, with bodies buried in Katyn Forest and other execution sites. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed Nazi Germany, only officially acknowledging Soviet responsibility in 1990. But the British embarrassment did not begin with the killing. It began with what Britain chose not to say. In 1943, Nazi Germany announced that it had discovered mass graves in Katyn Forest. Of course, Germany tried to use the discovery as propaganda. That made the situation even more difficult. If Britain accepted the German claim, it looked like it was helping Nazi propaganda. If Britain rejected it, it was helping Stalin bury a crime, and Stalin was no minor ally. By 1943, the Soviet Union was bleeding the German army dry on the Eastern Front. Millions of German troops were trapped in a brutal war against the Red Army. For Britain and the United States, Stalin was essential. So when the Polish government in exile in London demanded an independent Red Cross investigation, Britain found itself trapped between morality and military survival. The Poles wanted justice. Stalin wanted silence. Churchill needed Stalin. That was the triangle. Behind closed doors, British officials had serious doubts about the Soviet story. Reports pointed towards Soviet responsibility. The timeline did not fit the German version. The victims' documents, uniforms, and condition of the bodies suggested they had died before Germany occupied the area. Some classified British assessments treated Soviet guilt as extremely likely. But publicly, Britain avoided a direct accusation because breaking with Stalin could endanger the entire alliance. That is what made Katyn so shameful. Britain was not accused of committing the massacre. Britain was accused of helping bury the truth. The Polish government in exile had fought beside Britain. Polish pilots had defended British skies during the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers had fought in North Africa, Italy, and later across Europe. They were allies in blood. But when they asked Britain to stand with them over Katyn, Britain stepped back. The official explanation was wartime necessity. The unspoken truth was colder. Poland was important, but Stalin was more important. After the war, the embarrassment only grew. The Soviet-backed government took power in Poland, while the London-based Polish government in exile was pushed aside. For many Poles, Katyn became a symbol not only of Soviet brutality, but of Western betrayal. The crime had been committed in the forest. But the cover-up lived in diplomatic offices, classified reports, and carefully chosen words. For decades, the truth sat behind locked files and political caution. Even when people suspected the Soviets, saying it too loudly was inconvenient. It disturbed the clean wartime myth. Britain, America, and the Soviet Union united against evil. Katyn ruined that picture because it showed that one of the allies had also committed a monstrous crime, and the others had looked away. That is why the Katyn cover-up ranks above Coventry. Coventry was a controversy built on uncertainty. Katyn was a cover-up built on fear. Fear of Stalin, fear of breaking the alliance, fear of admitting that Britain's moral war against tyranny had depended on a tyrant. And for Britain, that was almost too embarrassing to face. And then came the secret Britain could not hide from the world, but still tried to hide from its own pride. At number 3 is not a hidden document, not a buried file, not a classified transcript. It was a surrender. A spectacular, humiliating, empire-shaking surrender. The fall of Singapore. The year was 1942. But the fortress itself had been imagined long before that. For decades, Singapore was the jewel of British power in Asia, a naval base, a trade hub, and a symbol of imperial confidence. The Great Singapore Naval Base was formally opened in 1938, equipped with massive docks, fuel reserves, airfields, and heavy coastal guns. It was advertised as the Gibraltar of the East, a bastion that could protect Britain's empire from any threat in the Pacific. On paper, it looked unbeatable. In reality, it was a myth waiting to be destroyed. Britain expected an attack from the sea. The giant guns faced outward, toward the water. The great fear was a Japanese fleet sailing south and trying to smash Singapore from the coast. But Japan did not come the way Britain expected. The Japanese came through the jungle. In December 1941, Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya and began a lightning advance down the peninsula. British commanders had underestimated them. They believed the jungle was too difficult for a modern army. They believed Japanese troops were weaker, poorly equipped, and less capable than European soldiers. They were wrong. The Japanese moved fast. They used bicycles, tanks, infantry, aircraft, and ruthless momentum. They outflanked British and Commonwealth defenses again and again. Airfields fell. Roads were seized. Units were pushed back before they could reorganize. By early February 1942, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore was trapped. The British and Commonwealth forces had numbers. Around 85,000 Allied troops were on Singapore, including British, Indian, Australian, and local forces. Opposing them was a Japanese force far smaller, roughly 36,000 troops under General Tomoyuki Yamashita. But numbers did not save Singapore. The defenders were exhausted. Many units had already been battered in Malaya. Morale was collapsing. Water supplies were threatened. Air superiority was gone. Japanese artillery and aircraft pounded the island. Civilians crowded into shrinking safe zones as the battle closed in. Then came the final blow. On the 8th of February 1942, Japanese troops crossed the Johor Strait and attacked the island directly. They struck the weaker western side of the defenses, where Allied lines were thin and confused. British command expected the main attack elsewhere, and by the time the danger was clear, the Japanese had already gained a foothold. The fortress was cracking. Street by street, position by position, the defenders fell back. Supplies ran low, communications broke down, Japanese pressure intensified. And on the 15th of February 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival walked under a white flag to surrender. The result was catastrophic. About 80,000 British, Indian, Australian, and local troops became prisoners of war. Many would later suffer starvation, abuse, forced labor, and death under Japanese captivity. Singapore, the great imperial fortress, had fallen in just 1 week of direct fighting. Winston Churchill was stunned. He later described it as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. That sentence explains why Britain found Singapore so embarrassing. It was not simply a defeat, it was the collapse of an image. For years, Britain had presented itself as the master of Asia's seas, the defender of empire, the power that could not be pushed aside. Singapore was supposed to prove that Britain still ruled the East. Instead, it proved the opposite. The Japanese victory shattered British prestige across Asia. Colonized peoples saw that the empire could bleed, panic, and surrender. The myth of white imperial invincibility was broken in front of the world, and that was the secret Britain hated most. Singapore had not fallen because it lacked walls. It fell because Britain had believed its own legend. From Singapore, Britain's embarrassment was public. Everyone saw the fortress fall. But the next secret was different. It began in the shadows, succeeded in spectacular fashion, and then produced consequences so brutal that Britain had every reason to step quietly away from the spotlight. At number 2 stands one of the boldest covert operations of World War II, Operation Anthropoid, Britain's role. The operation was created in 1941 when Czechoslovak intelligence, working with Britain's Special Operations Executive, prepared a mission to strike at one of the most feared men in Nazi Europe, Reinhard Heydrich. The attack was carried out on 27th of May 1942 in Prague by Czechoslovak agents Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, who had been trained in Britain and parachuted into occupied territory. Heydrich was no ordinary Nazi official. He was the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was head of the Reich Security Main Office. He was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. And to the Czech people, he was known as the Butcher of Prague. Under his rule, resistance was crushed, executions increased, and occupied Czechoslovakia was forced deeper into the Nazi war machine. So Britain and the Czechoslovak government in exile wanted a message sent. Nazi power was not untouchable. Even in occupied Europe, even in the heart of Hitler's empire, resistance could still strike. The mission was dangerous from the start. Gabčík and Kubiš were not commanding armies. They had no tanks, no air support, no escape route guaranteed. Their weapons were simple. Their success depended on courage, timing, and the help of local resistance networks. On the morning of 27th of May 1942, Heydrich's car approached a sharp bend in Prague. Gabčík stepped forward with a Sten gun. It jammed. For one terrifying second, the entire mission seemed to collapse. But Kubisch acted. He threw an explosive device at the car. The blast wounded Heydrich. At first, the Nazi leader survived, but days later, on the 4th of June 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died from his injuries. Militarily, it was a stunning achievement. Operation Anthropoid became one of the only successful government-sponsored assassinations of a senior Nazi leader during the war. It proved that the Nazis could be reached even behind their own lines. It boosted the legitimacy of the Czechoslovak government in exile and showed occupied nations that resistance was not just symbolic, it could be deadly. But then came the price. The Nazi response was savage. Thousands were arrested, many were tortured, many were executed. The villages of Ladice and Ležáky were destroyed in retaliation. Men were shot, women were deported, children were murdered or sent away. The names of entire communities were turned into warnings. And this is where the British embarrassment begins, because Britain had helped train and deploy the men who killed Heydrich. But after the reprisals, the story became politically uncomfortable. If Britain celebrated too loudly, it looked as if London had triggered the destruction of Czech villages from a safe distance. If Britain admitted too much responsibility, it risked turning a heroic resistance operation into a moral question. Was the assassination worth the cost? So Britain's role stayed quieter than the legend of the Czech heroes. The bravery belonged publicly to Gabčík, Kubisch, and the resistance. The horror belonged to Lidice and Ležáky. And Britain's hand in the operation remained in the background. That is why Operation Anthropoid ranks so high. It was not a failure, it was a success, and that made it harder to explain. A Nazi monster was eliminated, a resistance movement became immortal, but innocent villages paid in blood. And Britain was left with a secret too uncomfortable to fully embrace. Sometimes a covert victory does not end when the target dies. Sometimes it begins a tragedy no one wants to own. And then comes the strangest British secret of them all. Not a ruined city, not a massacre, not a fallen fortress, not even a covert operation gone too far. At number 1 stands a mystery so bizarre that even decades later, it still feels like the opening scene of a spy thriller, the Hess Affair. The year was 1941. Britain was still fighting Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities. Hitler was preparing to invade the Soviet Union. And Britain, though wounded, refused to surrender. Then, on the 10th of May 1941, something impossible happened. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, climbed into a specially prepared aircraft and flew alone from Germany to Scotland. His goal was not to bomb Britain, it was not to defect in the ordinary sense. He came with a proposal, a secret peace deal. Hess believed he could contact powerful figures in Britain, especially the Duke of Hamilton, and persuade them to negotiate peace with Nazi Germany. He hoped Britain would stop fighting Hitler, allowing Germany to dominate Europe and turn east against the Soviet Union. British authorities arrested him immediately after he landed. That alone made the case explosive. This was not a minor Nazi officer. Hess had been one of Hitler's earliest followers. He helped build the Nazi movement, served as deputy Führer, and held symbolic importance inside the Third Reich. He was not the battlefield genius of Germany, but politically, his name carried enormous weight. So Britain suddenly possessed one of the highest-ranking Nazis alive. And the embarrassment began immediately. If Hess was acting alone, then he was a delusional fanatic. But if he had support inside Germany, then his flight suggested division at the top of the Nazi regime. Even more uncomfortable, if Hess believed Britain had powerful people willing to make peace with Hitler, then who had given him that impression? That was the dangerous question. Because in 1941, Britain needed to show absolute unity. Churchill's public message was simple: no deal with Hitler, no compromise with Nazism, no negotiated surrender. But Hess's arrival raised a darker possibility, that some circles in Britain might still have imagined peace with Germany as an option. London could not allow that idea to spread, so Hess was locked away, interrogated, studied, handled carefully, and then buried under layers of secrecy. After the war, Hess was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy, and sentenced to life in Spandau prison. He remained there for decades, becoming one of the last living symbols of the Nazi leadership. But the files kept the mystery alive. What exactly did Hess say? Who did he think he was meeting? Was he tricked by British intelligence? Did Hitler secretly know? Was there a serious peace faction in Britain? Some Hess-related British Foreign Office records were released in 2017, including files about Hess and later British efforts surrounding his imprisonment. But reports on sealed archives have pointed to at least one British intelligence file, said to include interrogation material and correspondence connected to King George VI, remaining closed until 2041, a full century after Hess's flight. That is why the Hess Affair ranks as the most dangerous secret on this list. Not because Hess succeeded, he failed completely, but because his flight threatened to expose something Britain desperately wanted hidden, that even in the middle of a heroic war against Hitler, the politics behind the scenes may not have been as clean, unified, or simple as the public story suggested. To Britain, Hess was not just a prisoner. He was a living question mark, a Nazi deputy who fell from the sky carrying a peace offer no one wanted to discuss. And sometimes the most embarrassing secret is not what happened. It is the fear of what the documents might still reveal.